There is a kind of violence that leaves no blood. A murder committed not with hands, but with patience, with ink, with the slow, deliberate rearrangement of another person's soul until what remains is unrecognizable to anyone who truly knew them. And perhaps the cruelest truth of human existence is this: the people closest to us are often the ones most capable of destroying everything we ever stood for. What if I told you that one of the most brilliant minds in human history, a man who dedicated his life to exposing lies and celebrating individual strength, was betrayed not by enemies, but by his own blood? What if his words were twisted, edited, and weaponized to justify the very ideology he would have despised with every fiber of his being? And what if the person responsible wasn't a political operative or a ruthless dictator, but a woman who shared his last name, who kissed his forehead as he descended into madness, who claimed to love him more than anyone on earth? This is the story of Friedrich Nietzsche and his sister Elisabeth. A story of genius and mediocrity, of creation and corruption, of how a philosopher who wrote with fire and clarity had his legacy hijacked by someone who understood that the dead cannot defend themselves. The dead cannot speak. The dead cannot stop you from putting words in their mouth that they would have choked on if they were alive to hear them. Nietzsche wrote about power. He wrote about the strength to create one's own values, to say yes to life even in its most painful moments, to overcome the weakness that society breeds into us. He believed in individuals who could rise above the herd mentality, who could think for themselves, who could look at conventional morality and ask why. His philosophy was a celebration of human potential, of artistic creation, of intellectual courage. He despised nationalism, called it a disease of the spirit. He openly mocked antisemitism, referring to those who embraced it as poisonous insects. He ended his friendship with Richard Wagner, a man he once adored, partly because he could not stomach Wagner's descent into German nationalism and racial hatred. The irony of what happened after his death is so profound, so sickeningly absurd, that it would be comedic if it weren't one of history's greatest intellectual tragedies. How does this happen? How does a man's entire body of work become a weapon for the very ideology he explicitly condemned? The answer lies in something far more disturbing than political manipulation. It lies in family, in jealousy that simmers for decades, in a sibling who watched her brother's brilliance from the shadows and burned with the knowledge that she would never be his equal. Elisabeth was born into the same household as Friedrich, breathed the same air, received the same early education. But where his mind soared into territories that terrified and captivated entire generations of thinkers, hers remained earthbound. Where he saw complexity, she craved simplicity. Where he questioned everything, she sought certainty. And perhaps more dangerously than anything else, where he rejected the poison of racial hatred, she embraced it completely. In 1885, Elisabeth married Bernhard Forster, a man who represented everything Nietzsche found contemptible. Forster was an anti-Semitism of the most virulent kind, a nationalist ideologue who believed in the purity of German blood and the necessity of separating the races. He had been dismissed from his teaching position due to his extremist views. He dreamed of creating a pure Aryan colony, away from the contamination he believed was corrupting Europe. And Elisabeth didn't just tolerate these views. She shared them. She championed them. She saw in Forster's hatred a righteous cause worth dedicating her life to. Nietzsche was horrified. He tried to maintain distance from his sister's marriage, from her husband's poisonous ideology. In his letters, he referred to anti-Semitism with open contempt, calling them failures who needed to blame others for their own inadequacies. He saw nationalism as a prison that prevented individuals from achieving their true potential. But Elisabeth didn't care what her brother thought. She had found her purpose, and that purpose would lead her to the jungles of Paraguay, where she and Forster would attempt to build Nueva Germania, a colony of pure German settlers who would escape the supposedly decaying European civilization. The colony was a disaster. Settlers arrived expecting paradise and found poverty, disease, and isolation. Forster, overwhelmed by the failure of his vision, took his own life. Elisabeth returned to Europe, not broken by the experience, but hardened. And she carried with her the same ideology that had driven her husband to his death. But now she had a new mission. Now she had something far more valuable than a failed colony in the jungle. She had her brother. You see, in 1889, something terrible happened. Friedrich Nietzsche suffered a complete mental breakdown. The mind that had produced some of the most provocative philosophy in human history collapsed into silence. He would never write another word. He would never think another coherent thought. For the final 11 years of his life, he existed in a twilight state, cared for first by their mother, and then, after her death, by Elisabeth alone. The genius was now helpless. His work was now vulnerable, and the only person standing between his legacy and the world was a woman who fundamentally disagreed with everything he stood for. Can you imagine what that must have felt like? To be a philosopher whose entire life's work was about the power of the individual mind, reduced to a body without agency? To be unable to speak while someone else speaks for you? To have your words, your thoughts, your very soul in the hands of someone who never truly understood you? Elisabeth wasted no time. She established the Nietzsche Archive, positioning herself as the sole guardian and interpreter of her brother's work. She controlled access to his unpublished manuscripts. She controlled what would be published and what would be suppressed. She controlled the narrative, and she began, with calculated patience, to reshape his philosophy into something he would have recognized only as a grotesque distortion. Her greatest crime was a book called The Will to Power. Nietzsche never wrote this book. He never published it. It was assembled by Elisabeth from fragments of his notebooks, incomplete thoughts, abandoned ideas, passages he had rejected. She arranged these fragments in an order that suited her purposes. She selected what supported her interpretation and ignored what contradicted it. She created the illusion of a coherent philosophical treatise that Nietzsche himself had never intended to exist. And the message she constructed from these fragments? A celebration of domination, of conquest, of the right of the strong to rule over the weak. She stripped away the complexity, the artistic sensibility, the psychological depth, and left behind something brutal and simplistic. Something that would appeal to people who wanted intellectual justification for their darkest impulses. Something that would become required reading for a political movement that was gathering strength in Germany. When Adolf Hitler rose to power, Elisabeth saw an opportunity. She welcomed him to the Nietzsche Archive with open arms. There are photographs of them together. Hitler gazing at Nietzsche's death mask. Elisabeth hovering nearby like a proud curator. She presented him with Nietzsche's walking stick as a gift. The architect of genocide, receiving a relic from the philosopher who despised everything he represented. If Nietzsche had been able to witness that moment, it would have destroyed him more completely than any mental illness ever could. But here's the question that should keep you awake at night. Did Elisabeth know what she was doing? Was she a cynical manipulator who understood that she was distorting her brother's legacy for personal gain and political power? Or did she genuinely believe that she was protecting his true message from misinterpretation? Did she convince herself that the brother she grew up with, the man who called antisemitism poisonous insects, would have approved of the ideology she attached his name to? This is the terrifying thing about self-deception. It is bottomless. The human mind has an almost infinite capacity to justify its worst actions, to believe its own lies, to construct a narrative in which betrayal becomes protection, corruption becomes preservation, and destruction becomes love. Elisabeth told herself that she knew Friedrich better than anyone, that she understood what he really meant, even when his explicit words said the opposite. And perhaps that is the most dangerous kind of person in the world, not someone who knows they are evil, but someone who has convinced themselves they are righteous while committing atrocities of the spirit. When Elisabeth died in 1935, she received a state funeral. Nazi officials lined the streets to honor her. She was buried as a hero of the Reich, the woman who had given National Socialism its philosophical pedigree. And somewhere beneath the ground, the actual philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche lay suffocated under the weight of her distortions. The damage she caused would take decades to undo. After the war, scholars slowly began the painstaking work of separating Nietzsche's actual philosophy from Elisabeth's fabrications. They went back to the original manuscripts, compared them to her publications, and discovered the extent of her manipulation. They found that she had altered passages, added emphasis where none existed, and arranged fragments in sequences that completely changed their meaning. The Nietzsche that generations had been taught to hate was, in many ways, her creation, not his. But here is what haunts me about this story. The damage cannot be fully undone. The association between Nietzsche and fascism still lingers in popular consciousness. People who have never read a word he wrote still believe he was a proto-Nazi philosopher. His name is still invoked by those who seek intellectual cover for ideologies of domination. The poison Elisabeth injected into his legacy has not fully dissipated, even now, more than a century after his death. And what does this tell us about the nature of truth? That it is fragile, that it can be overwhelmed by repetition, by authority, by the confidence of those who claim to speak for the dead, that a single determined person with access to the right materials can reshape reality for millions of people. That history is not written by the victors alone, but by the survivors, by the relatives, by the inheritors who can mold the past to serve the present. Think about your own legacy for a moment. What happens to your words after you are gone? Who will speak for you when you cannot speak for yourself? Who will have access to your letters, your journals, your unfinished thoughts? And can you trust them to represent you honestly, even if honesty contradicts their own interests, their own beliefs, their own ambitions? The truth is that we are all vulnerable in this way. We spend our lives building meaning, creating, expressing, trying to leave something behind that reflects who we really are. But the moment we lose control, whether through death or incapacity, that meaning becomes raw material for others to shape as they see fit. And the people most likely to have that opportunity are not strangers who might approach our work with objectivity. They are the people closest to us, the ones with the strongest opinions about who we should have been. Elisabeth could not accept that her brother despised her husband's ideology. She could not accept that his brilliance was separate from her worldview. So she rewrote him. Not with a single dramatic act, but with 1,000 small choices over many years. An emphasis here, a selection there, a rearrangement that shifted meaning without obviously falsifying anything. Death by 1,000 edits. And by the time anyone realized what she had done, the false Nietzsche was already more famous than the real one. There is a lesson here about power that Nietzsche himself would have understood, even if he never imagined it being used against him. The greatest power is not the power to create. It is the power to define. The person who controls the narrative controls the meaning of everything that came before. And the dead, no matter how brilliant they were in life, have no defense against those who outlive them. Let this story remind you of something uncomfortable. You do not fully control your own legacy. You do not own the meaning of your own words once they leave your mouth or your pen. And the people who claim to love you the most may be the ones most capable of betraying everything you stood for, all while believing they are honoring your memory. Nietzsche once wrote that there are no facts, only interpretations. He could not have known how cruelly that insight would be applied to his own life. His sister proved him right in the worst possible way. She took his interpretations and replaced them with her own. And for decades, the world believed her. What does not kill me makes me stronger. Nietzsche wrote those words as a testament to human resilience. But what about the things that happen after we are already dead? What about the violence committed against our memory, our meaning, our soul? That kind of destruction does not make us stronger. It simply erases us. And in our place, it leaves a ghost that wears our face but speaks with someone else's voice. The lonely one offers his hand too quickly to whomever he encounters. Perhaps that is why Nietzsche never fully escaped his sister's shadow. Perhaps blood was a bond he could not bring himself to sever completely. And that loyalty, that weakness, became the doorway through which his entire legacy was corrupted. If this made you think deeply, make sure you like this video, share it, and subscribe for more.